Hi class. We're going to start this course with a basic tutorial that will introduce you to what's called match moving. Match moving is a technique that allows computer graphics to be inserted into live action footage with correct or believable position, scale, orientation, and motion. Also known as motion tracking, match moving is what allows movie monsters to run down Main Street, robots to run through crowds, buildings to explode, or environmental or man-made catastrophes like tornadoes or explosions to look real, but nobody gets hurt. Match moving or motion tracking is the essential starting point for all VFX projects. Without it, everything you do will look like it's been faked. At this point, I'm assuming that you've installed Matchmover 2014 and 3ds Max 2016 on your home computer. To get started, you need to first go to the Week 1 folder and open that up. And you'll have the instructions here. And to get started, you need to click on the lion plate, download and extract the zipped file. So I'll do that. And I'm just going to save this to my desktop for now. It's going to be lion_plate.zip. And we'll save that. And here's my lion_plate zip. And I'm going to right click on that. And in Windows, you can just do extract all. And what I want to do is, if I do the default, which will send the extracted folder to the desktop, and create a new folder called Lion Plate, and then stick another folder inside of that called Lion Plate, rather than do that, I'm just going to delete this, so it will send the folder just to the desktop, like this, and then click Extract. And if you've done this successfully, you'll have the Lion Plate folder on your desktop. And if you open it up, inside of it, you'll have these images. And they're just JPEG images. And it should be lion000.jpg to lion050.jpg. So there's 51 pictures. And this is called an image sequence. And a lot of times I'll be referring to this as the plate, the video plate, because nothing's been added to it at this point. So it's a clean plate. Now that you have the Lion Plate downloaded and extracted on your desktop, you need to create a project folder for this project. And I expect you to create a project folder for every project that we do in this class using your last name and then an underscore and then the name of the project. In this case, it's going to be the Basics project. So I'll create a folder for myself, and I'm going to just create this on a jump drive so I can take this into the lab if I want to go in there and work on my project. And you should think about this. If you want to bring your project into the lab, put it on a jump drive, and then everything will be there because that's your project folder with all the assets needed to open your project inside that folder. So on my computer, I have this 30 gigabyte jump drive. I'll open it up, and I have nothing there, so I'll create a new folder, and I'll name that mote_basics. And this is my project folder for this project. You're going to name it using your last name _basics. And inside that folder, we don't have anything. But I'm going to get this Lion Plate and drag it over and drop that into my project folder, my Mote Basics project folder. So you can see here, I'm inside my project folder, and I've got my Lion Plate in there. And now I can just delete the zipped folder because I don't need all that stuff on my computer. Now you can open up Matchmover 2014. You need to do a couple things before you can use Matchmover with 3ds Max. First, you need to choose Edit Preferences and go to the up axis, which by default Matchmover is Y, and change that to Z. You need to do that because the up axis in 3ds Max is the Z axis, and then click OK. Next, you need to change the interface from light, which is indicated up here in the upper left-hand corner, from light to full. And that will give you all the windows you need to work on your project. And when you're done with those two things, you're ready to load your image sequence, which are the images in the lion plate. You can do that by going to File, Load Sequence, or just double click on the image sequence. And then you need to browse to your drive where you have your project folder. In this case, my project folder is moat_basics. It's going to be your name _basics. Open that up and you'll find the lion plate. Double click and open that. And you'll see the 51 images from 000 to 050. And click on the first image and leave all these defaults where they're at. And we're going to use the frame rate of 24 frames per second. That's going to become important when we export the video out of 3ds Max, that we set Max up to export at 24 frames per second. But we'll get to that when we get to that. And click OK. And it loads this sequence into the viewer. Down here below the viewer window, you'll see your playback controls. And you can click play, and it will play. And in my case, it stopped. Or you can loop it so that when you play it, it goes forward and then plays again. Or you can turn on ping pong so that it goes forward and backward. Like that. And you could grab this little bar here and move it back and forth on the timeline, so we can set it back to the beginning using that, or we can go and click on go to first frame, and it puts us back at the first frame. We can also use Control and Alt to zoom in and out on the viewer window, or down here in the timeline, which is down here below the viewer, we can use Control and Alt and then click on the left mouse button and hold it, and then drag back and forth to zoom it in and out on the timeline. So now we see that we have the 51 frames here expanded on the timeline. For this project, we're just going to let Matchmover track the 2D points as defined by pixels of high contrast relative to the pixels around them. It's going to find those points, it's going to track them, and the way we're going to do that is use automatic 2D tracking. So go up here to do 2D tracking, and then go down to automatic tracking and click on that. And it gives you this automatic tracking window. And just to show you, there's this settings dialog. These can be changed for more sensitivity or less sensitivity, higher density in terms of the number of points it's looking for or creating, or less density. But we're just going to leave that at the default. And you can track using grayscale or colors. We'll leave that on grayscale. And just click Run. And you can see it's tracking all these points. And now it's solving and creating a camera. A virtual camera in 3D space that matches the camera that was originally used to shoot this video. And if we grab this little bar and kind of scrub back and forth, you can see all the tracks that were created. And we'll bring it back to the beginning or to the first frame. And we're looking at these tracks in 2 dimensions. If we want to see what's happening in 3 dimensions now, because these are all points established in 3 dimensions, click on the 3D icon, and then you can use these tools down here to pan, dolly, or orbit. So click on the pan tool and hold down the left mouse button, and you can move this around. You can dolly it around, and you can now see this series of blue cones resemble the outline of that lion. And the camera is clear over here. But what we want to do is look at this the way the camera sees it. So go to View and click Lock on Camera. And now we see what the camera sees. So if I play this, you can see the view that the camera sees. Up here, this grid is actually the ground plane. Now we could move that down and fix the location of the ground plane and the scene, but we're not going to bother with that this time for this tutorial. What we are going to do is click Stop, is pick one of these targets as the point that we're going to align a box to when we put this into 3ds Max. What I'm going to do is zoom in on this by holding Control and Alt and left mouse click and drag it in, and then use the pan tool to click and hold the left mouse key and drag this up so we can look at these different points. Right here, this point or this point looks like a good place to put the box. So let's try Auto 680, and it says up here in the label Auto 680. So just select that and type in Align to Me. Now when we export this camera and all these points, we'll be able to see that we'll be able to find this point in 3ds Max called Align to Me, and we'll be able to create the box and align the box to that track. So the only thing left to do is go to File and Export, and make sure you're on 3D Studio Max for the file type, and type in your last name, an underscore, and basics. And then make sure that you're still inside of your project folder. For me, my project folder is mote_basics, and I'm going to save this as an MS file. I've already saved it once in a previous session, but you're going to save it. And make sure that all tracks that match is selected, because I had selected that track and it's the only active track. That would be the only track that gets exported. I want to export all the tracks that match, and the camera, the 3D points, the distortion grid, and animate the camera, and I will click Save. And of course I'm going to replace my old MS file. Oh, MS stands for Max Script. And we're almost done with Matchmove. Go to File, Save As, and save it as your last name underscore basics. And it will put the MMF extension on it. MMF stands for Matchmover File. And click Save. And of course I'll replace it again. And now you can close Matchmover. And the next step we're going to be doing is opening up 3ds Max importing the Max script files, the camera, and the points, and we'll start adding the box or CGI to this project. Welcome back. Here I have 3ds Max 2016 open. You can also use 2014 or 2015, but it's best to use 2016 since that's the version available in the labs. Before we get started, what we have to do is configure Max to work with the Max script file that we exported out of Matchmover. So first we need to change the unit setup. So go to Customize and go to Units Setup, and by default it's going to go to Generic Units. We want to change this to US Standard feet with decimal inches, and then go to the System Unit Setup button, click on that, and in System Unit Setup change it from 1 unit equals 1 feet, 1.0 feet, to 1 unit equals 1.0 inches, and that should take care of the unit setup for matching with Matchmover's units. And then click OK. The next thing we have to do is change the rendering output size to match the image size of the lion images. So I'm going to open the lion plate images and take a look at what we have there. I'm going to open my 30 gigabyte jump drive, and inside that I have my project folder called Moat_Basics, and I'll open that, and here's the lion plate, and I'll open that, and then I'll select any one of these images and look down below here, and it tells me that the dimensions of that image are 720 by 576. So I can minimize that now. And I'll go to Rendering and Render Setup. And hopefully we can get all this in here. Yeah, I think we will. And under the common parameters, output size, let me scroll this up here. It defaults to custom 640 by 480. So you need to change the width from 640 to 720 and change the height from 480 to 576. And then close that. Now we can run the Max script file that we created in Matchmover. So go to Scripting and Run Script, and browse to your wherever you saved your project folder. Go inside your project folder and find your MS file. For me, it's moat_basics.ms, and click Open. And now we can see in these viewports what we have is all these tracking points and a camera. I'm going to change the perspective view by clicking on perspective, go to cameras, and here's the real viz camera that was created by Matchmove, and we can change the perspective view to the match view, and you can kind of see the outline of this where the lion would be. But we want to see these points as they relate to the image sequence or the video. So we're going to right click on the real viz and edged faces and go down to configure. It's kind of out of the screen. I'm going to move this down so we can see it better. There, now we can see it. So there's configure, and we can go to background, or you can right click and go to viewport background, and we still can't see that. I'm going to move it down even more. Right-clicked on Realistic Edge Faces, Viewport Background, and Configure Viewport Background. So that kind of gets you the same place, Viewport Configuration, and I'm in Background, and in the Background tab. I'm going to move this all back up here. Okay. Now, we're going to use files for the background of that viewport, of the camera, RealViz camera viewport. So use files, and we want to animate the background. Instead of just one frame, we want to see all 51 frames. And the aspect ratio, we want to check match rendering output. We've set the rendering output to 720 by 576, and so we just need to match the rendering output to the image size that we set up and the output size of the 3ds Max. And then click on Files, and again go to your computer, locate your project folder for the Basics project, go into the Lion plate and select Lion, the first lion000.jpg, and down here, clear down here at the bottom. If sequence is not checked, make sure you check sequence, because you want to load all those images in the sequence. And then click Open, and just leave this on the default and click OK. And because we did this out of the RealViz camera, what we want to do is just apply it to the active view. We don't want to apply to all views in the active layout tab, because it'll be hard to work in those other views if we have that image in the background, but the image doesn't relate to what's being seen in those views. So we're only applying it to active view, which is the RealViz camera view. You can see it came on, and then click OK. And now we can play this, and you can see those points are moving with that lion shape. I'm going to enlarge that view a little bit. So, and I can drag that. Now, you notice when I drag this, the background and the points move together. If it doesn't all move together, means you're going to have to do one more thing, and that is go to Customize, Preferences, then go to the Viewports tab, and down here where I have, you can see I have Update Background While Playing. Make sure that that's checked. I'll uncheck it, click OK. And you can see now when I drag it, see how the lion is sitting still and those points are moving, and it doesn't update the background until I let up on the mouse. Or if I play it, see, the points are all moving around, but the lion's not moving. So if you have that problem, like I said, go to Customize, Preferences, select the Viewports tab, and check Update Background While Playing, and then click OK. And now when I play it, the background image will move with the lion. So let's go back here to frame 0 and go up here to Production Render and render this RealViz view. And here it is. It's black. That's because we need to put the image sequence into the environment so that it gets rendered along with anything that we add in 3ds Max. We're going to be adding a box, but we need to be able to see the lion in this view too. So go to Rendering and Environment, and then click on, under Common Parameters for Environment Effects, under the background, click None, double click on bitmap, go to your computer, navigate to your project folder, open that up, go to the lion plate, and click Lion 00. You notice when we added the sequence as the background, it also added this IFL file. You don't have to worry about that. Just always make sure you pick lion00.jpg. And down here again, make sure that you've checked sequence, because we want to load the whole sequence into the environment. And then click open and click OK. And now it's going to use that map, and notice it's using the lion00.ifl sequence. We'll just leave that open for now, and let's try another render. Render production, and that looks crazy. That's because it's spherically mapping the environment image into the scene. We need to change that. So go to your material editor, and just to make this easy, select the first slot and name it environment, and then click on the map and hold your left mouse button down and drag it over and drop it into that first slot, and then choose instance and click OK. And you can see how it doesn't look right here in the material editor. That's because down here the mapping, it's an environment map, and the mapping is spherical environment. So you need to change that to a screen map. And now it looks like it should look. And we can close that, and we can close the environment effects map. And now when we render the production, you have the lion, and it looks correct. I'm going to close the rendering window, and now it's time to put a box into this scene. I'm going to see all the views here, and again I can play through that, and you can see this camera. I'll go up to top view, and you can see how that camera is moving in the scene to match the movement of the actual camera that shot that scene. It's just kind of magic the way that happens. Actually, it's an algorithm that determines all this stuff. And right here is the statue in this area. And this is the wall back behind the statue. And this is the, I think this would be the light pole. We'll go back to the quad view and select those points. Just click anywhere on where those points are at, and you'll have all these points, but they're in a group. In order to identify the individual points, what we need to do is go to group and ungroup them. And then you need to go to group and ungroup them again. And now, after ungrouping the group twice, now you can see the individual points. Click anywhere to deselect those, and you can click on the Align to Me and go to the Modifier panel, and you can see that that has become a point helper in Max. And it's a cross, so let's make that a box so we can see a little bit better. And let's increase the size of that point helper. And now you can see it down here. I'll go in on the real viz. You can see that point helper. There's a big box down there. And we really don't need to see the rest of these. So we'll just right click and hide unselected. So now I've gotten rid of all those points that we don't need. And here's the points. Now unfortunately, here's our home plane for the view, which should be down here, but it's up here. Now, like I said, when we did this, we could correct that. in Matchmover. And in later projects, we will be correcting that by creating a 3D coordinate system. But for this project, we don't need to do that. What we're going to do now is create the box. I think to create the box, the best way to do this would be to go into the top view. And you can see that point helper there. And let's create a box and just kind of draw it over top of the point helper and raise it up. And you can see the home grid for the top view, or in this camera view, is up here. So the box is floating off the ground. We want it to align it to the point helper that we named Align to Me. And here it is down here. So we go to, with the box selected, make sure you have the box selected, and go to the Align tool, click that, and then go down here in the RealViz camera view, and when you get over top of the Align to Me point helper, just click on it, and this may or may not be checked, but you have to check X, Y, and Z position. That moves that box down, and you want to align it to the pivot point. The pivot point of the box, because we created it in the top view, is in the bottom center of the box. That's why we create that in the top view. Otherwise, if we created it in the front view, the pivot point would be on the side. So we want that pivot point on the bottom, and the pivot point for the point helper is just a point, so everything will be lined up. You can also align it by the X, Y, and Z axis, but it really doesn't make much difference. And then click Apply, and then click OK. Now you can go into the box and you can change the width. I think I'll make it just a little bit smaller. Let's try making it 2 inches. And I'll copy that and paste that into these. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. I don't want that big, huge box sitting there. So let's render, go back to the first frame and do a production render. And now we see the lion with the CGI element, which is the box, sitting on the ground. At this point, you should evaluate the scene for motion discrepancies. The first giveaway that a VFX scene is fake is when CGI objects that are supposed to be stationary appear to be floating relative to objects in the original video scene. You could render the scene out as a video, but I think in this case, and in some cases you would want to do that, but in this case we'll just kind of step through it here on the timeline by just advancing one frame at a time and just looking at the box and see if it is moving with the camera and with the background. And it looks pretty good. So that's the first thing you want to do. After you place your objects in there, make sure that everything's moving and it doesn't, the box or whatever objects you put into your scene don't look like they're floating around all over the ground. If you are having a problem with it floating, about the only way to fix that is go back into Matchmover, do that whole process again. It's pretty quick, and then pick another point as the point that you're going to align your box to, and then go through that process again, and then go and check for motion so that's consistent with the motion in the video. After you've done that, it's time to start adding lighting and shadows that match the lighting and shadows in the original video. Look at your lion scene. Try to decide where the light is coming from and what type of light it is. You know, is it direct light, which in this case it probably would be. and how bright the light is and all those things. So you're looking for an overall sense of the lighting, the color, and everything, and how dark or bright or how dark or transparent the shadows are. And once you've done that, then you're ready to start putting some lights into your scene. Now it's time to start looking at the lighting and shadows, because now we need to put some lighting and shadows on that box so they match the lighting and shadows in the original scene. You do this by looking at the objects in the original video scene to see what side or sides are brighter than other sides, how dark the shaded areas of the objects are in comparison. You also need to consider the shadows cast by the objects in the scene, how transparent or opaque they are. Do they have hard or soft edges? Once you've evaluated the scene for lighting and shadows, you can create the light or lights needed to duplicate the same lighting and shadows for the CGI object that you created that will match the lighting and shadows in that scene. Getting lighting shadows right is the next most important aspect of creating a believable VFX scene. Since this scene's shadows are very diffused, you could try a skylight. But because this increases the rendering time considerably, we're just going to add an MR area omni to the scene. We could also switch from the scanline renderer to the mental ray renderer, since mental ray can create more realistic and accurate lighting for these kinds of projects, but we're just going to keep it simple and stick with the scanline renderer. So what we're going to do is go back to the top view and place an MR area omni in the top left side of the box, and then in the left view move it up on the box. So I'm going to go create lights, change from photometric to standard, get an MR area omni, and I'll just click here in the top view, kind of behind the object, and I'll put that light down here. It's on the ground, which is actually way above the box. And we want to make sure shadows are turned on, and we'll get the select and move tool, and in the front view we'll move that up higher and get it up above the box quite a bit. And we could kind of maybe move it back a little more, and I'm going to enlarge the material edge faces, and we can see the box, and it's kind of lit on the top there. And if we render that, pull this over, do a production render. And we can render this out, do a production render, and there's a box. Doesn't look like it's lit properly, and it's not throwing any shadows on the ground. Well, that's because there's no ground in our scene yet for it to throw the shadows onto. Let's close this render window and go into modify, and let's change the name of this light from MR area light omni 01 to key light. And go back here, make sure I have that light selected. So that's our key light. And we're really not sure what the shadows look like yet, because like I said, we don't have any ground in our created in order to create the shadows. So we need to create a ground plane in the top view again. So I'm going to go up here to top view, and I'm going to create geometry, and get a plane. Then I'm going to make a nice size plane that'll cover that whole area, or most of it. And I'm going to make the length segments 1 and the width segments just 1, because it doesn't have to move around, or doesn't have to, it's just going to be flat. We're just going to make these 1 segment because in this case we're just going to make it flat. If this was the side of a hill, we'd have to model the plane so that it would throw the shadows the same way as it would on a hill, or if we wanted shadows to be thrown onto this lion, we'd have to actually model the lion too. But in this case, we're just going to make a flat ground plane, and it's up here floating above the ground. So we're just going to align it by clicking the Align tool and go down and get the Align to Me selected. You can see it lights up, and then click on that and make sure that it's XYZ position, pivot point, and XYZ orientation, and click OK. And now we have a ground plane here. So if we render that, we have our box, and we want the shadow. See the how the shadow on the lion is coming kind of back this way. So we want the shadow to be kind of in the front and behind this box, the same as the lion. So we're going to have to move that the light a little bit. So we'll just move it back, and you can see as I move it, because I'm in realistic and edge faces, actually I'm going to turn off edged faces, just make it realistic, and I can see a bit of a shadow coming out, and maybe I need to move it just a little bit more. Get this and move it. So now down here you can see that the shadow is coming out and behind the box, and we'll render that. Whoops, wrong view. Render the Real Viz camera, and now it has a shadow onto this plane that we created for the ground plane. And while I'm here, I'm just going to lock to the viewport, the Real Viz viewport, so when I render, if I'm in another viewport, it'll always render the Real Viz view. When everything's working correctly in Matchmover, there's no problem. But sometimes you might end up with something that looks like this in Matchmover, where your grid is perpendicular to the camera view. And here's the grid here. I put a yellow box around it. So when you put that into 3ds Max, what you end up with is the camera pointing down. Here's a Max project with the camera in the location where it should be, and it should be pointing out this way. The home grid is on this line here, and you can see it over there. So when I put the plane in the top view, you can see it's up here halfway, and then we had to align it to the Align to Me plane helper. I want to do that, which brought it down to the ground. The problem is, if you started out with in Matchmover and exported that MS file with that grid perpendicular to the camera in that view, again, I'll show you the view. Here it is. Here's the grid. And you're going to end up with a camera pointing down. One way to deal with this is to redo the Matchmover project. Sometimes, even though you changed the preferences to the Z as the up axis, the 3D up axis stays at Y. And if you look over here in the project pane, when you're in the 3D view, if you look in the project pane, you'll see the 3D up axis might still be on Y, and you can just simply change that to Z, and now it's in the right direction, and here's your grid. Let me rotate that. See, your grid's up here. Rotate back up, and you can see here's the grid, here's the camera, and that fixes it. Sometimes your 3D up axis will still be Z, and you'll still have this funky looking grid perpendicular to the camera view. So if it does say Z, sometimes you can fix it by just changing it to Y and then changing it back to Z, and then export your MS file, and then open it Max and check Max and see where your camera's at. So here's Max with the bad camera position, and if you fix that in Matchmover and run the new MS file, it should look like this. So that's one way to fix it. Redo Matchmover until you get it right and the camera is oriented the way it should be. Okay? Or the other way to do it is had one student who created her home grid or her plane, and she created it in the top view, but if you look at it, see, it's perpendicular to the camera, so when you render it, all you're going to have is that grid there. I want to do that. So you really, instead of creating it in the top view, the ground plane, create it over here in the front view, and that'll put it down and oriented to the position of the camera. And you can see over here in the left view, here's the home plane line. Here's that plane I just created, and you can see it's where it should be. So you can deal with it that way, and it will work. There's the align to me down here where it should be. I'm going to select all these other point helpers and hide that selection, and then go back up to the align to me point helper and get in the point helper parameters and roll that up as a box, and you pretty much see that that home plane now is on the ground where it should be, even though things weren't right. It's closer than doing it the other way. And remember, we started, this camera's pointing down in the left view instead of pointing from right to left along the ground. But you can still get the home plane, and you can get the align tool and then align it to the align to me point helper and on the X, Y, and Z position. But you cannot align it on the local, align orientation local, because as soon as I do X, Y, and Z, it flips it up into the air. So you cannot align it on the local axis. You just align it in the world axis and apply that and click OK. And then I will go to the object properties and make that ground plane see-through. And you can see there's the point helper, and increase the size of that. So you see my point helper here, and now you can see it's locked on position in the ground. So if I create a box for this project, I'm going to create that in the front view instead of the top view. Here's a box. I'll just create it here. And I'm looking over in the left view so that the bottom of the box, or the box, will be coming up, see, from the ground plane. And I'm going to move it so I can see it. Where are we at? Okay, there's my point helper, here's my box, and I'm going to make sure my box is selected and get the align tool and align it to the plane helper on the X, Y, and Z position. It's really huge. And I'm not going to align the local orientation. I'm just going to apply it and click OK. And then I'll bring the size of the box down quite a bit. And get that in the scene. So now you can see that the box is in sync with the video and with that camera move. So that's another way to do it without having to redo the Matchmover file. Hopefully this helps anybody that got stuck with that. Matchmover, it's kind of a funky program, but it's free. So it has these little idiosyncrasies that you have to deal with, and you just learn over time how to deal with them, and hopefully this will give people a better idea of how to deal with problems when they do happen. Now, we saw the plane, so we need to hide that. We want to have the ground that will receive the shadows, but we want to be able to see through that ground into the background. The way we do that is another material. So go to Material Editor. In your second material slot, call that Ground. And go to your standard material selection and click on that. And in the material map browser, go down to Matte Shadow Material. And what this matte shadow material does is has a checkbox. By default, it's checked to receive the shadows and affect the alpha. And that's all we have to do in this case with this Scanline Renderer matte shadow material. So we can get that material, and I'm just going to drag it down and drop it on that plane. And I'm going to name that plane Ground Plane. And we'll render that view out. And now we see through the box, or through the plane, to the video behind it, but now we have a shadow being thrown out from the box onto that plane. But we need to do some more lighting. We need lighting to light the front of the box the same way that it's lit in the scene. So let's get another light. And I think what I'll do is I'll just hold down the shift and I'll drag, which will create a clone of that first light. And we'll make it a copy so we can affect it. And we'll rename this Fill Light. And you can see how it's starting to fill things in. And let's render that. And you can see it's too dark over here on this side where we need some more light, so we need to move that light over. Now do this in the top view, and I'll watch it down here in the camera view until I've lit up that side of the box. Okay, and the top of the box is going to be lit more than the sides, so I'm going to turn off shadows. So I don't want this fill light to throw any shadows. I just want it to light the box. And I'm going to go to the intensity and roll that down to make it look about the same intensity as the lion. And I'll render that. That's starting to look pretty good. Maybe a little bit more on, I'm going to move it back here to put a little more lighting on the back of the box, and I'll render that. And that looks more like what I wanted to see. And let's see, one last thing. I'm going to re-render that. Sorry. And I want to look at this now and look at the shadow and see how the shadow looks. Is it about the same as the other one? In this case, it looks pretty close. And I really don't think that there's anything we have to do with that at this point, because the fill light is kind of making the shadow less opaque or less dark. We could go back to the key light and go into the shadow parameters, and we could bring the density down a little bit and render that, and that's even better. So the density's down. I have it at 0.86, and that's fine. You play around with it, get it to look the best as you can. And I think to make this more consistent with all the other gray things, or maybe add a red, this kind of a rust red color to the box. I'm just going to do that simply by selecting the box and going in and changing the object color to kind of this rust red color, and click OK and render that, and we'll go with that. Okay, so we've got the box now, and it's got a shadow. Now that plane that we made, select this, you could adjust that. So if that box had to, if it was something that had to walk out of this path and come over here, this plane, to accept the shadow, would have to extend out into this area. And you can see we can move it, and we can resize it as needed to cover the area that we need it to cover. So let's render that out and evaluate it. You know, how does the light look? Does it look realistic? Does it match the lighting in the scene? In fact, I think I'm just going to make that box gray because it'll be easier to evaluate. Click OK and re-render it. So as a gray box, now I can see it's not, the lighting's not quite the same. So let's get this Omni light, and I'm going to move it over a little more, and I'm going to bring the brightness up on it, or the intensity, and render that. That's looking better. Okay, and we have a bit of a shadow, and I really think that shadow will be fine. So the next thing we want to do is evaluate this for the light color. The color here seems to have kind of a bluish cast to it. So let's get that key light. And we're going to change the color to kind of a blue, just a little bit, and render it. And maybe a little bit more. And render that again. So it's starting to pick up a little bit of the blue. And we also want to, I'm going to change the color of the shadows a little bit and put light effects color shadow and render that. Okay, And let's do the same thing with fill light. Light effects, color, shadow. It doesn't really have a shadow on the fill light, but we can do the color, and we'll just kind of match it so it's pretty close to what it was, and on the key, and that's not looking too bad. Maybe just a little bit too much color on that. Bring that down a little bit and render that again. And now we're seeing that. I'm going to bring up the multiplier on the fill a bit. And render that. Okay, that's not looking too shabby. But maybe I'll move that fill light around a little more and just try to get a little more definition on the box. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. Let's close the render window. And now let's take a look at the motion blur. As this video plays, I'm going to render frame 0. And you can see the lion, the lamp, pole, a post, these lines on the pavement. Everything has nice sharp edges, and so does the box. But let's move in here to frame 25, where you can see, and I'm going to make this bigger. Whoops. Make this bigger. You can see how this lion starts to blur because of the camera moving blurs that image. And if we render that, you can see the lion is blurred, but the box still has real sharp edges. And that brings us to the next thing that you have to try to match when you're creating a VFX project, is match that camera blur. So to do that, just select the box and right click on it and go down to the object properties, and we're going to add motion blur to just the image, and we'll leave it at 1 and click OK, and then we'll render that and evaluate it. So there's a lot of adjusting, rendering to see how it looks, and I think that looks pretty good. Now you could adjust, let me go in here, object properties. If we made this like 0.5, clicked OK, and rendered it, whoops, and where's my render? There it is. And rendered it. It's not quite as blurry as this other stuff, as the objects in the scene. So, like I said, I think having the motion blur set to 1 just seems to work out just fine. Click OK. And now we have our motion blur to match that blur. But if we go in a bit to someplace where it's nice and sharp and render it, you can see it's got quite a bit of blur compared to the background. So maybe I do need to go in and change the object properties. Let's bring this down to like 0.7, and we'll render that. And that looks better. Okay. So essentially we have our VFX scene all set up. And now it's time to render the completed VFX scene as a video. So you need to go back to rendering and render setup. and change the time output from single to active time segment, which would be 0 through 50, and then go down to where it says render output and check save file and go to files, browse, and we're going to render this, where do you think? Onto or into our production folder. So go to your basics folder and just be inside the basics folder. Do not put it inside the line and plate folder. And what do you name it? Your last name underscore basics, right? So it's moat for me underscore basics. Now go down to save as type where it says all formats and open that up and change that to AVI file and click save, and you'll get this AVI file compression setup. And your default might be DV video encoder. You don't want that, and you don't want uncompressed. What you do want is the MJPEG compressor, and it's very important that you choose this MJPEG compressor for rendering your output from Max while you're working in this course. So, and I'm going to bring the quality up to 100 and click OK, and then you can render your project out. And I'll bring it up here where you can see it, and you see it rendering one frame at a time, and the render is going pretty quickly, and I'll be back when it's done. And the render is done, so we can close up the render window. Close your render setup window, and if you haven't done so, and you should probably do this one last time, go to the Max and save your Max project file. Make sure that you're saving your Max file into your project folder, and I've already saved mine once, but make sure that you save it as your last name underscore basics. Let me move this up so maybe you can see it better. There we go. Mode underscore basics, and it will be a Max file. Save that. I've already saved it, so it's going to replace it. And you always want that last version of your Max file to send to me so that I can open your project, and if there's a problem I can advise you on how to correct any problems you have. And then go to your project folder and open it up, and inside your project folder here, it's Moat Basics for me, you should have a lion plate folder with your lion plate images, the image sequence. You'll have your moat underscore basics or your name underscore basics AVI file, your Max file, your MMF, that's the Matchmover file, and the MS file, which is the Max script file that you generated out of Matchmover. And before you're ready to send this in, make sure that you open up your AVI file and play it. Make sure it's playing all the frames. One problem students have is they only render out one frame. So make sure that you've rendered out the entire sequence. Go to your project folder and right click on it, and on a Mac or on a PC you can do send to compressed zipped folder, and that's what I want you to do is zip this folder, and I'll come back when it's done doing that. And there's my zipped folder, moat underscore basics.zip. Yours should be your last name underscore basics.zip, and this is the folder that I want you to submit to me.